The Prix Galien is a welcome initiative to stimulate creative research and promote excellence. Barack Obama. The Galien Awards ceremony is considered the equivalent of the Oscars night for the innovators in the labs and awards every year the best pharmaceutical product, the best biotechnology product, the best medical technology, and the best digital health product.
This is the right event, on the right issue, at the right time.
I thank His Excellency, the President, for bringing Prix Galien to Africa, and I look forward to the day when we will celebrate an African winner of the Prix Galien.
I'm particularly grateful to receive this award.
The awards are among the highest honors in science and commerce because they lead to improvement in the human condition.
The Prix Galien Awards recognize the world's brightest minds and most innovative companies. They are a true celebration of the hard work required to produce life-changing interventions.
That is what makes us optimistic about the future.
Congratulations to all of you.
Make a difference. Join the Galien Foundation. The Galien Week of Innovation has been made possible thanks to our precious friends and partners who share the Galien Foundation's values. First off, the two exclusive platinum partners are We would now like to acknowledge our two gold partners. Furthermore, we proudly introduce our corporate leaders partners. The associate partners are the grantors are To conclude, we are extremely fortunate to work with outstanding media partners who have contributed to the Galien Foundation's renown.
Welcome to the Galien Foundation Week of Innovation webinars here in New York. My name is Centricity. I'm the Chief Growth Officer of Medable Inc. and your moderator today. In this series of webinars, we provide context for the Prix Galien US Awards to be held this Thursday here in New York, in conjunction with our annual Galien Forum of Speakers representing top scientific experts and leaders in global health. We have a shared ambition to innovate to improve the human condition, and therefore we have developed this new webinar series to give our nominees for Best Pharmaceutical, Best Biotech, Best MedTech, and Best Digital Solution Product greater visibility so they can describe the journey of medical discovery. This year's Galien US Awards has a record 84 nominees for these 4 categories, from 65 companies covering 15 diverse therapeutic areas, ranging from cancer, cardiology, and neurosciences to infectious and rare disease. We will be looking closely at these products together in all these critical areas throughout the week. Because of the number of nominees and range of conditions represented and all of the excellent science, the Prix Galien USA Awards Committee has decided to host a series of 14 webinar nominees prior to the Forum and Awards ceremony, where the nominees will be describing the innovation and the winners in each of the 4 best of categories will be announced. In the best pharmaceutical agent category, which is our focus today, we will be holding 6 webinars. This webinar, in the hour we have allocated, is devoted to the 5 nominees in the second set of our nominees in the solid tumor cancer class. Together, we will focus on the central question: what is the state of progress in building new therapeutic and diagnostic platforms to fight major cancers and address their prevalence in vulnerable populations, including the aged, minorities, and pediatric patients? For context, OncoHealth FDA reports that oncology will continue to represent one of the largest components of total healthcare spend. Costs are expected to rise 9 to 12% annually through 2025, exceeding $260 billion globally. Given this unmet need, approximately 85% of accelerated approvals in the past 10 years have been granted in oncology, and the FDA has approved 66 oncology-related drug indications in 2020, far surpassing the 2019 pre-pandemic number of 42. It is with this in mind that we emphasize the innovations of this category and the expertise of this panel. And before we begin, we ask our audience to look at this quick poll ahead. Help us to understand your perspective on this question. What is the most promising new medical advance likely within the next 5 to 10 years? Please select a single choice. Effective and accessible vaccines for major global killers such as HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. Solving the blood-brain barriers issue, which leads to advances against a variety of neurological disorders, including clinically effective treatments for Alzheimer's. Or the introduction of comprehensive diagnostics and therapeutic vaccines as a preventative tool against a wide variety of cancers. Further refinement of safe, clinically effective CAR-T and other cell gene editing therapies across tissue types and disease conditions. Or lastly, widespread use of patient-friendly digital and biosensor platform technologies that control or prevent the progression of major chronic disease. Let's move into our discussion. I'll start by introducing quickly our esteemed panelists, and I'd like them, after their introductions, to tell us a little bit about themselves further and what inspires them about the innovations that their companies bring forth. We have with us Ted Johnson, Research Fellow, Medicinal Chemistry, Pfizer Oncology. Adam Shayevitz, PhD MDA, Medicine Team Group Lead, Pfizer Oncology. Juan Camilo Arjona, Chief Medical Officer, Myovant Sciences. And Peter Langmere, Group Vice President of Oncology, Targeted Therapeutics at Incyte. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Panelists, would you tell us, please, about yourself as well as the innovations that you bring to us? We'll start with Peter.
Hi, well, thank you very much for having me on this panel. So my name, again, is Peter Langmere. I'm responsible for clinical development of our targeted therapies for cancer at Incyte. And our goal fundamentally is to try to bring new therapies that specifically target the tumor and address unmet needs in cancer. And so the drug that we've developed, that's the topic for today, Pemazyre pemigatinib, is a targeted therapy that we studied in cholangiocarcinoma, which is a rare liver cancer, and where there's a very high unmet need. These patients get chemotherapy as their initial therapy, but most of them will progress, and then after that, there are no options for these patients. And so through our clinical development pathways and our collaborations with numerous people inside and outside the company, we were able to bring a new therapeutic to the market that's now available in the US, Europe, and other regions in the world.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Juan, have
Thanks,
a
Hansen.
go ahead, Adam.
Apologies. Adam Shaywitz. I'm a global development lead in Pfizer Oncology, responsible for the colorectal cancer, melanoma, and breast cancer franchises. So, here today to represent Braftovi and Mektovi. As many people know, Braftovi was originally developed by Array Biopharma and has since been developed through Pfizer and Pfizer Oncology. This is a drug or a group of drugs that target the BRAF genetic mutation. So these are mutational drivers in the oncology space, again, that contribute to more aggressive or more advanced disease. And what we and others have shown is that by targeting the BRAF mutation with Braftovi and Mektovi, you can not only extend survival, but increase the quality of life of patients that are suffering from a variety of diseases, in particular metastatic melanoma, which is, a very common and an area that represents a significant unmet need. So happy to be here today, happy to represent the Braftovi team, certainly the work that's been done by all of our colleagues at both Array and Pfizer, and looking forward. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Adam.
So my name is Ted Johnson. It's a pleasure to be on the panel. I am representing Lorbrena, or lorlatinib, which is a drug for non-small cell lung cancer in patients that have ALK mutations in a specific gene called ALK. And it's interesting. So most of these patients are fairly young. And so they're not, so they typically, when they're diagnosed, they're stage 4. And so we had several challenges on the program, one of them being resistant mutations, but also metastatic disease. And so one of the things that that's important to our programs is that we consider that. So Lorbrena does cross the blood-brain barrier and it's able to treat metastatic disease. And yeah, so that's, we can talk more about Lorbrena a little bit later, but I work in the preclinical space, so in the design of the drug, but very important to collaborate with clinicians to understand what their needs are so we can design that into the drug early on.
Thank you, Ted.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Juan Camilo. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Myovant Sciences, and I'm representing Orgovyx or relugolix that has been approved for the treatment of advanced prostate cancer. At Myovant, we are dedicated to advance the development of medicines that are satisfy unmet needs. And this product particularly was initially discovered and developed by Takeda. Prostate cancer is the second most common cancer in men, and it has probably one of the largest disparities, which is something we care significantly. Black men have twice the risk of dying of prostate cancer compared to white men. And there's a lot of access problems for the Black community to medications for prostate cancer. So we saw, even though there's been a lot of progress in the treatment of prostate cancer, still this remains a high unmet need. Till now, the treatment of prostate cancer, the androgen deprivation or the reduction of testosterone was using agonists. And relugolix is a GnRH antagonist, which is a more appropriate way to reduce testosterone. Instead of stimulating testosterone, we reduce it from the beginning. But finding antagonists has been very challenging, and it's been something that has been pursued for decades. And this is the first and only oral GnRH antagonist that's now approved for prostate cancer. So we're very proud about this approval.
Well, congratulations to our panelists. Certainly, it's an incredible investment to bring these innovative products with novel mechanisms of action to these unmet need categories. I'd like to mention to the audience that there is an accessible link that would further describe these nominated products for you to review as we continue with the discussion. So now I'd like each of us to think about the meat of our talk today, and briefly address some critical questions for our audience to understand in context of these innovations. So first, why did your company choose to focus on the disease state and indication associated with your products? Why don't we start with you, Juan?
Yeah, thank you. As I was mentioning before, this is a high unmet need, and we saw that from the get-go. When we obtained this product from Takeda, it was very clear that the use of injectables to reduce testosterone had many limitations. One, the fact that patients have to come to the clinic to get the injection every month, every 3 months, which for many is a challenge. Some patients travel for hours to go to the clinic to get their medication. Second, the disparity that I mentioned already in terms of access to care and the outcomes of disease in the Black community being substantially worse than for white patients. It's interesting to think that in this year, it's expected that approximately 300,000 men will be treated or initiate androgen deprivation therapy in the United States alone, which is this treatment to reduce testosterone, which is has been the core of prostate cancer care after surgery and radiotherapy have failed. And then with these limitations, having now an oral option allow a lot more flexibility for treatment. In fact, that there's a GnRH antagonist would also provide more control to physicians. And it was very important for us, particularly within the pandemic, where access to care became even more complicated, and the availability of a drug that could be shipped to patients was certainly something that would be valuable. And I think because of all of this, we were lucky to get a prior review by the FDA and get an expedited approval to bring this drug to the hands of the patients that needed it.
Maybe Adam, you could give us your experience as well.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. So, I think when you think about metastatic melanoma and you think about genetic drivers such as BRAF, I mean, it was a big deal, about probably about 10 years or so at this point, maybe a little bit longer, where the world recognized that BRAF mutations, play a huge role in driving the disease, and that we have compounds exist that you can use to target the BRAF axis to slow down the progression of the disease for these patients. So the evolution, the recognition of a genetically driven mutation in a metastatic setting in the cancer world is a big deal, and that's consistent across lots of different tumor types and lots of settings. With that recognition and the ability to develop, a best in class, or certainly very, very effective and tolerable BRAF inhibitor was a great opportunity, and there was an area that was great unmet need. As I said before in the introduction, a lot of this work was initially done through Array Biopharma, which started off as a medicinal chemistry company, but evolved into a fully integrated company that was eventually acquired by Pfizer a number of years ago. So really was kind of the recognition of the unmet need in this space, the realization that the BRAF is a genetically driven mutation that can be targeted by a therapeutic in the melanoma setting, and then the ability to address that unmet need through medicinal chemistry. And then from there, I think through some hard work and strong operating experience, they're able to demonstrate that not only does it work, but it can work and reach a broad group of patients, and really responsible for kind of bringing BRAF-TOVI to the world and helping to address it. So I think that in a nutshell, it really was just the appreciation, the ability to develop a drug that targets that that mutation driver, and then to demonstrate that there's a survival advantage and an efficacy and a safety profile that is tolerable for patients that have this disease.
And Ted and Peter, as you think about the different unmet needs that your innovations represent and the different types of breakthroughs, tell us more about your experience.
So with Lorbrena, actually, Pfizer had a first generation product that was an inhibitor of ALK, and what we learned from that product is that it was Patients were progressing on therapy pretty quickly, maybe after 10 months, and they were getting brain metastases. And so this was kind of new back in 2010 when we started the program. We wanted to get a kinase inhibitor into the clinic that not only treated the resistant mutations that were coming up, and these were the reasons the patients were progressing on the current therapy or the first therapy, but also we wanted to cross the blood-brain barrier with a kinase inhibitor. And this was something that hadn't really been done successfully in the past. And it was a high risk because once you get a drug into the CNS, especially when in your body or brain, there might be over 500 protein kinases that you could be inhibiting, you need to do that safely. And so that was a big risk for us. And so we focused quite a bit on developing the drug and designing the drug to meet the to essentially be potent against these resistant mutants, but also be very, very selective for the ALK protein. And so we wouldn't disrupt any other proteins in the CNS. And so now, actually, there was a phase 3 trial run head-to-head with the first generation product, and it showed it's far superior, not just in terms of systemic disease, but also CNS disease or metastases. And it was approved as a frontline therapy several months ago.
Great. So thank you. So we've been interested in FGFR, fibroblast growth factor receptor, as a target for a long time, and many companies have been interested in this. And to be honest, a lot of the initial results were not very successful. And in part, that was probably because many of the drugs were not either particularly potent or particularly selective. And in part because the target wasn't very well understood, that FGFR may be one of many alterations in some tumors, so targeting it may not do much on its own, whereas there may be other tumors where it's a key driver. And so our chemists spent a lot of time trying to develop a potent selective inhibitor of FGFR, and our biologists spent a lot of time trying to understand where this target really was a key driver in the tumor, where we could try to target those specific alterations. And so we ended up in cholangiocarcinoma, where, as I said, there's a very high unmet need. After first-line chemotherapy, these patients try any number of different chemotherapies or other therapies. Tumor responses are very rare. Most patients progress within a couple of months. And so through our clinical trials, we were able to show tumor responses in over a third of patients. These tumor responses were generally quite durable. We were able to manage some of the side effects that we see with this class of agents, and ultimately ended up with the approval. So it was really an effort by a lot of people from start to finish in developing the drug, from the initial chemistry through the biology, through the clinical development, and ultimately onto the market.
All of you have, there's a mixed risk-benefit profile across these assets. I'd love to hear more about the outcomes that you would like to see, if not yet fully understood, the best outcome you'd like to see for each of your products.
Yeah, so I'm happy to start if that's all right. I mean, I think if you look at the data from Columbus, which was the trial that we ran in metastatic melanoma, compared to the standard of care, we basically doubled the efficacy, right? So in oncology, we look at progression-free survival, or the time it takes for a patient to progress with the disease, and it basically went from about 7 months to about 14 months, give or take, compared to the standard of care. So we really, well, in the grand scheme of things, one would argue 7 months is not that long. You double the time that it takes the disease to progress, which is a pretty meaningful outcome from a clinical perspective. So, I think you talk about the measurable impact. I mean, it really is if you can delay the progression of the disease, and it also correlates to overall survival, which we, I wouldn't say that we doubled, but we I'll say statistically significantly increased, is meaningful for an oncology patient.
Maybe I'll jump next. In the prostate cancer space, and the mainstream treatment is based on first on reduction of testosterone, and this has been done for decades. First with estrogen, with surgery, orchiectomy, and then more recently with GnRH agonists that stimulate testosterone, desensitize the pathway, and then lead to suppression. And the search for an antagonist has been long and full of challenges. And just relatively recently, the team at Takeda was able to synthesize and discover this molecule, relugolix, that works as an oral antagonist and then blocks the receptor in the brain and then leads to downstream reduction of testosterone. And what this does is that it provides a rapid suppression of testosterone in patients that require that suppression. It doesn't have the stimulation that happens at the beginning with agonists. And then provides, and we've shown in an elegant study in our phase 3 program that it provides suppression that is comparable or better than those that you see with an agonist. And what that does is provide that control to the physician to reduce testosterone when it's required. And as I mentioned before, the other piece where I think it can have impact on outcomes is that availability of an oral drug that can be shipped to patients. It avoids this visit that's required for visits. It avoids the injections that most men don't like. So it provides this access to androgen deprivation therapy that can be more available to patients in different regions and hopefully address that unmet need.
How about you, Ted?
Yeah. So interestingly, our product Lorbrena, it's treating patients, adult patients that have non-small cell lung cancer. They're typically never smokers. They just get a random mutation in this ALK gene. But interestingly, there's actually other ALK mutations and other indications for this. And one of them is childhood neuroblastoma. And so there's children that get a mutation in the ALK gene as well. And there's ongoing trials with Lorbrena to treat those patients. And it's one thing, it's gratifying to treat adult patients and see these successful outcomes, whether it's with systemic disease or brain metastases, but it's a whole another level when you're treating a 3-year-old that has, neuroblastoma, and you're having an impact not only on that patient, but that patient's parents and family and friends. And so it's been pretty rewarding for me. And me coming from preclinical space, right? So I'm not used to seeing patients, but I've met many patients, and I've gotten hugs from patients. This was pre-COVID, and but that it's been a really rewarding experience.
Peter, as you think about your own unique population, I mean, it's a combination of the outcome and the experience that we hope to give to our patients. Tell us more.
Yeah, I could just say, I think, what to follow on what Ted was saying, that part where the patients express to you the value of the medication and of the work you've done, that's it's really extraordinary. That's why we all do this. In terms of the outcomes with our drug, as I said, for chemotherapy in this setting, we were looking at response rates of 5% or less, 2 months progression-free survival. And with Pemazyre now in the FGFR2 selected population, we're seeing response rates around 36% and durations of response of average of 9 months. So, still there's more work to be done, but being able to hear from patients who've received the drug and had benefit is incredibly rewarding. So we're still doing a lot of work understanding mechanisms of resistance, and have ongoing study in the first line setting, trying to compare against standard chemotherapy in these selected patient populations. But yeah, seeing the value of what you do can be incredibly rewarding.
Given the, just the unmet need and the ability to live longer and healthier lives, considering the contrast, patients, which are also different for each of your categories, are certainly going to benefit extremely from this innovation. What we do observe, however, is, before it even gets to the patient, we need to educate and achieve that level of adoption with our clinicians. So can you tell us a little bit about how your companies plan on doing that, and what the clinician response has been thus far or is expected to be?
Maybe I'll chime in first, if that's okay. I think that what you just said resonates a lot with me. I think that for many of these conditions that we're talking about, that are not always understood or known by everyone, but also some of them that can be associated with stigma and taboo, and certainly that's the case in prostate cancer. Awareness and advancing the conversation at the patient level, but also in many physicians, talking about the inequities that I was mentioning earlier, are key to improving the outcomes more broadly. So I agree with you that not only is about creating new options, but also making them understood and available to physicians and patients. And so far on our end, we've been very fortunate that people have been waiting for an antagonist for a while. So there was some awareness about the potential before. But with that said, it requires a lot of work to explain and to provide that visibility and understanding. And then to start using it, which is a different way. We're all used to this, the way we've done things, and change is always difficult. And I think that it's working across functions and across different sectors in society that we implement change.
Yeah, and if I can add. Sorry, I was going to add to that. I think that there's a patient awareness and an education component of it as well, right? Like, to extend the conversation to the we'll call biomarker selected patient population, or groups of patients that have these genetic mutations that Ted and I and others have talked about. There has to be a continued increased awareness and education for screening and for testing, right? So I'm not necessarily talking about testing in a healthy patient all the time, though maybe there is a place for that, but really in a patient that's been diagnosed with cancer, to think about getting, whether it's a multi-analyte panel or certainly genetic specific mutation to that tumor of interest or the tumor of question or the disease of question that you're talking about, is really important, because I think it's important to make sure that physicians and patients are constantly aware of the continued evolution and understanding of the biology and the therapeutic agents that we either have in development or have available, if approved, to help treat those drivers. And it's a constantly evolving paradigm, which is a good thing, truthfully, right? As we make better therapies.
Maybe I could follow up quickly on that. I mean, I fully agree, and it can be a real challenge in many tumors. I mean, I think if you are diagnosed with breast cancer, you sort of automatically get screened for a number of genetic alterations. But for many tumors, that doesn't happen, and partly because there are no drugs available. Like, what's the point in screening if there aren't any drugs available? But then once you start to have drugs available, you need to try to make the screening available. So I think it's going to be a huge effort, and the point you made around awareness, that to try to get patients screened, which will make them amenable to new therapeutics that are coming along, even some that are in early clinical trials, to help us identify the genetic alterations that are key drivers of those tumors, develop new therapeutics and so on, and ultimately provide benefits for patients. So I see that as being a major innovation that's going to come over the next few years as we start to screen more patients.
It's incredible, the depth of innovation that has happened so quickly in these categories, rather, in the last decade or so. What's also amazing is that the work is yet to be concluded, as the adoption has to happen, the understanding and the awareness has to happen for us to see the ultimate outcome for populations across the world. And even more so, access for patients across the world needs to happen as well, right? So we're really at the very beginning. In that context, I'd like to ask you all about the challenges that your company has faced or you yourself in transitioning from early proof of concept to human trials and ultimately to market authorization. Any lessons learned, any barriers you've removed, any efforts that you have taken to improve this awareness of your product or products in general in this category. Maybe Peter, we can start with you here.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that the main lesson I have, and this is true for any clinical development, is really the value of collaboration. And I talked a bit earlier about the work that we did within Insight, the chemists and biologists and so on. But especially in transitioning from that early proof of concept stage through to getting it on the market, that doesn't happen without extensive collaboration, particularly when you're in a rarer disease space. So, collaboration with those investigators and scientists to try to understand what is the role of the target, which tumors should we be looking at, which patients should we be selecting for this drug to identify where this is going to work best. We just talked about screening and obviously partnership with the diagnostic companies, trying to understand how best we screen patients, what are the different methodologies that are available, what have been validated, what still needs new work. Partnering with the regulatory authorities is critical, especially at an early phase of development, trying to understand as early as possible, what are the endpoints we need for our clinical trials? How can we design our clinical trials to deliver the data that's ultimately going to get us to the approval? And probably most critically is the patient advocates. And for us working with groups like the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation, really trying to understand what do the patients need? I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. And how do the patients feel about the current therapies? What are they looking for in a new therapy, and how can we get that to them? And I guess the last point is just in longer terms and looking forward, how do we collaborate with each other in terms of other pharma companies, other biotech companies? I think a lot of us develop, a drug for an indication, but there's still room for improvement. And how do we ultimately work together to develop our therapies together, or screen patients for multiple different medications and so on? I think that's certainly an area that we will need to continue to work on moving forward.
Juan, everything perspective here.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, everything Peter said resonates a lot with me. I think that drug development is certainly a very challenging endeavor, and you find many hurdles as drugs advance through the different stages of development. We had at Myovant a slightly different context that made it added new challenges. We started as a new company in 2016, and we got this products from Takeda that we decided to develop into 3 large phase 3 development programs for 3 different indications. And for a small company, taking phase 3, which requires all the collaboration and all the cross-functional interactions that Peter was talking about, as well as the interaction with the regulatory agencies, brought a lot of challenges to us, and made it very exciting too, to try to run trials that would be satisfactory to regulatory agencies everywhere in the world, because as you pointed out earlier, Hans, we want to ensure that we're helping as many patients as we want in a very patient-centric mindset. So we overcome, thankfully, all those challenges through a lot of hard work, collaboration, and support from many, not only within the company, but outside, that allowed us to bring Orgovyx to market.
I think the other thing that I can add on to that at least we think about a lot on the Pfizer side, is the diversity in clinical trials. And we think about making sure that we reach a diverse patient population. And you can interpret that a couple different ways, which is appropriate, right? It can be diversity in that you are at a minimal level or minimum amount, beating the consensus of the epidemiology of the disease in your study, right? So like diversity in that, making sure that you have at least a demographic in your study, in your clinical trial, that's reflective of the census of the population, right, of the geographies of interest of the world. And then there's the broader context of diversity in regions, and making sure that you've got global studies. So not just like, is it a diverse population in the US, and do you have minorities appropriately represented that align with the epidemiology of the disease, But beyond the US, do you have appropriate representation from Asia and Eastern Europe and Western Europe and all the other different regions of the world? So you really do have a global program. And that, that's hard and it takes a lot of work and effort, but it's something we've been thinking about a lot as we move our clinical development plans forward.
Thank you, Adam. You speak on that topic. It's very dear to my heart as well. You may or may not know this, but Medable is a decentralized clinical trial platform. And so as we execute about 150 trials with unique technologies across about 80% oncology, it's one of our biggest concerns as well. And so happy that this panel has been thoughtful about that and the innovative efforts that you're all undertaking. I'd like to open us, now that we know much more about your product, the patients, the clinical outcomes, and the physician perspectives, I'd like to open us to a broader discussion about the future. And, I encourage us to think big and bold here. You're all scientists. You've been living in the R&D space. You invested your lives developing these really amazing scientific technologies. Where do you see the next wave of innovations trending, either in your area or more broadly?
So maybe I can start. I think to follow up from sort of what I was talking about before is some of the in terms of identifying the molecular targets, screening patients, but then really getting down to a very precise level of detail. I mean, as I said, we've seen tumor responses in patients that really had no hope, but the response rate is 36%. More than half of the patients are still not responding. Why is that? How can we address the unmet need in those patients? How do we address resistance? How do we identify, in the vast number of molecular alterations, which are the ones that are going to respond, and of those that don't, how do we address those? And then how do we collaborate together? And I mentioned this at the end of what I was saying before with other companies, because we're all developing different drugs. How do we partner together? And it can be as simple as things like screening patients, because, if I screen a patient for my trial and have some, a tumor sample that I screen for that, is the next company that comes along going to be able to screen their patient because maybe there's no tumor left? So how do we, at a very basic level, cooperate in being able to screen patients for these trials and then develop drugs together? And I think we're all at a certain level competitive with each other, but at the same time we all have the same mission, which is to deliver new medicines for patients. So I think that there's a vast amount of information that's becoming available on the molecular targets that we're trying to hit, that essentially may subdivide the patient population smaller and smaller. So then it becomes more and more critical to work together to address the broadest population of patients as possible. And that's where I see both the opportunities and the challenges moving forward.
Certainly, especially as we get more predictive and more focused on niche patient populations, bringing science to everybody, and biology means also bringing the patient in closer to the research, perhaps sooner. That's, from a macro perspective, I feel the biggest opportunity in terms of screening and pre-screening, identifying those triggers sooner. Would any of our other panelists like to contribute to the next wave of innovation question?
Yeah, I'll add to what Peter was saying. I think that when you look across this panel and the work that each of our teams have been doing, you find the patient at the center, right? We're talking about that oncology in general, but development also, and other therapeutic areas is becoming more and more patient-centric. Personalized medicine in oncology and some of the points that Peter was making is kind of like at the core, because everyone's tumor may be different, in that the diagnostics and access to diagnostics will become something critical. So having that's something we feel very strongly about, is making sure that everyone is included, that the voice of the patient is part of the approach to development. And now the work in diagnostics is another thing that I see changing very rapidly, continue to change very rapidly, in the next few years that will help us advance not only identification of patients that are right for certain conditions, but also new targets that will allow us to help more patients. So I'm super excited about what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in this space.
Might I ask, my observation is that our industry has been dedicated to patient centricity for quite some time, but each of our organizations may take a unique perspective on that, what that means. Might I ask you to, anyone on the panel, to provide how your organization is taking that approach today?
From my advanced perspective, we've looked at it in a couple of ways. One is, as I just discussed, in finding really groups that have unmet needs. But we have a whole side of our company dedicated to advocacy as another thing we do beyond just developing drugs, because I think that when you talk more and more to patients, then you find ways you can help that were not necessarily what you would include in the drug development side of things. And you find the inequities, and you have, as Adam was saying, the inclusivity and diversity that you need in your development programs to really have the broader impact that I think we all want to have, as Peter was mentioning. We all have the same mission, but it's just listening to the patient and being in the trenches with the patients to fight their daily fights, that the way we see us approaching that patient centricity beyond just the diagnostic and the specific target.
Yeah, it's very similar for us. I mean, I think it's working with patient advocates, really trying to understand from them what are the needs for the patients, what are they looking for in a new therapy. I think we get very focused in clinical development on meeting regulatory endpoints, and that's obviously very important. I mean, we have to get the drug approved, but in many cases there are other endpoints that are critical to the patients. And again, listening to the patients, as Juan said, understanding from them what's valuable for them, interacting with those patient advocate groups as much as possible is really going to help us to be as patient-centric as possible.
I think one of the things that we, and I'm sure others on this call, have done is that we've really started to involve patients in these advocacy groups that Peter and Juan talk about in the development of our studies, right? So we actually will work with patients to share our protocols or these synopses before they actually get finalized, to understand, like, is this a study you'd want to participate in? Is this too many visits to the hospital? Is this too many biopsies or too many blood draws? Like, are you willing to volunteer for this kind of a thing, to make sure that we're not designing a clinical research program in a vacuum, and that it's amenable to the patient population that we hope to work with in the future.
Ted, I might ask you, as you look at the pediatric community, how is it that you would really understand that need or that experience in that type of population?
I think that's a really challenging area, and it's kind of unfortunate. And this sort of goes back to the discussions around clinical trial design. But unfortunately, those trials for the pediatric patients are still ongoing, right? And this drug, Lorbrena, has been approved for adults for 3 years or so. And so it was given breakthrough therapy status for non-small cell lung cancer in these adult patients, but in children, it's really lagging behind. And I guess this is maybe where some of the panelists groups and the patients and the clinicians and the researchers can get together and work with the FDA, because you have to work with the FDA to try to accelerate some of these trials for young children. And it's been sort of unfortunate, but I've seen this happen where there is a pediatric population that can be treated, but it typically is just very, very slow.
Well, it's, we've come a long way, and married with scientific innovation, it's inspiring to see us evolve the patient innovation around it, for hopefully the ultimate health economic outcomes that we all want for the world. In that context, there's a ton of new areas of innovation in science that we haven't even sort of started to touch the surface of. And I would ask you to think and communicate to us what excites you most, which areas, maybe even yet out of reach, that are going to drive forth innovation, and the most difficult areas are you working on, and what excites you the most?
I think that I'll start. There's a couple topics. One is immuno-oncology, and how do we harness the immune system? And I know we've done that to some degree. Maybe it hasn't moved as quickly as some people had hoped, but I think there's hope with like mRNA, for instance, right? That's a hot topic right now for COVID, but you can also use that to induce an immune response toward cancer cells. So that's one area I think that is going to really be hot over the next few years. And the other area that I'd really like to see grow more is gene editing or gene therapies, because mostly because it's just so transformational, since it typically will cure the disease versus having progression-free survivals for 10 months or 20 months, but it's actually repairing the gene. So those are the two areas where I'd like to see some breakthroughs, like in the next 5 to 10 years.
The other area that I see that, the other area that I see, because I agree with Ted, 2 points. I think that the use of artificial intelligence in advancing our understanding that can power some of the things that Ted was talking. I think we're just scratching the surface of that, and with all the challenges that it has to really think of how to use artificial intelligence, the power of computers today, and how it can advance the speed at which we think about things and connect the dots across multiple areas. I think that we don't even understand right now how powerful that can be, and I see that accelerating over the next 5 to 10 years too.
Actually, that's a perfect segue to some of our questions that are coming in from our audience. And one of them is specifically beyond the science. So, how is the organization innovating, whether that's in its structure, in its collaboration, or with technologies to further the outcomes that your products or your portfolio aim to achieve for patients?
I mean, I can start, not to get too sidetracked here, but the development of the COVID vaccine and the manner with which it was created has really changed, or has the potential to change, how we think of drug development in its entirety. And certainly from a Pfizer perspective, right? I mean, it obviously, when you have the pressure of a global pandemic, it's a slightly different situation, but people are obviously inappropriately asking questions. Why can't we develop new oncology therapeutics in the same period of time? And what learnings do we have from the pandemic and the development of the various vaccines, not just the Pfizer one, that we can apply and leverage into the oncology drug development space? So as I think about the future, like, to me, it's, the biggest changes are going to be the ones that we've already kind of seen happen in other areas that we're going to try to bring into the oncology space as much as we can.
I think that's very true. I mean, I think we saw over the last year and a half a lot of barriers come down in terms, internally and externally. I think companies got protocols approved quickly. We saw protocols get initiated quickly, and as you said, it was a global pandemic. It was a worldwide emergency. But cancer is a worldwide emergency too, and it would be nice to see some acceleration there, and some of those barriers come down as well. To enable more patients to get on clinical trials and develop new therapeutics faster. And I'll just echo what Juan said about the artificial intelligence. I think that's a huge area that we're just starting to benefit from, and because there's just this vast information overload. The amount of information that's becoming available, even on a single individual patient, is just extraordinary. And how do we tap into that? And a human mind is not going to be sufficient to do that. We really need to take advantage of the artificial intelligence techniques to be able to capture that information and use it as best we can to develop new options for patients. So I think that's definitely a huge area I would agree with.
Well, thank you.
I would like to put one thing on what Adam said, because it really, and Peter, because I think that's the one thing we learned from this pandemic is that we can be more, reduce or increase our tolerance to risk. And then with the right sense of urgency, things can happen. But it has to be across multiple parties that are part of the development process, right? It's not internally. It's the patients too. The tolerance of risk, that we all got vaccinated with a drug, with a vaccine that was approved for as an emergency use. So it's the sense of urgency and tolerance of risk across all levels can allow us to do this in a more streamlined and hopefully efficient way for many patients.
It appears, we may embark on perhaps a new risk-benefit perspective as we reflect on what has been accomplished in only the last year. So, I want to thank our panelists, not just for the scientific innovation, but the attention to the patient need and the focus on that patient experience. I think that we are inspired as a team and as an industry to learn from the accomplishments, the challenges that we have overcome in such a short period of time that in some ways have challenged the orthodoxy in our industry, and emphasize the importance of us working together on the value chain for the overall outcome. Before we close our panel, let's quickly see the results of the poll, and I'd love our panelists to comment on the results. So the question was, what is the most promising new medical advance likely within the next 5 to 10 years? It looks like a leading split between solving the blood-brain barriers and introduction of comprehensive diagnostics and therapeutic vaccines. I'll pass it back to the panel for their comments.
I'm actually not surprised.
Yep.
Sorry, Peter.
I was just going to say, I'm not terribly surprised by that either. Those might have been the two that I would have picked.
Yeah, we weren't allowed to vote, but I would agree would have gone with those two. I think I talked a little bit about the diagnostics, right? I mean, broad-based diagnostics. I mean, being able to get ahead of things is going to change how we treat things, right? And that's just a fundamental shift in being proactive versus reactive. And you've got to figure out, and develop the right tools and the right the right way to go about doing it, because it's a bit of a double-edged sword. But I do think that's going to be the future.
Well,
yeah, and access to those diagnostics. I think that I would have chosen the diagnostics too, and with a little bit of a spin to it. And I always go back to the example of prostate cancer, where Black men get disease earlier in their lives, and the current guidelines make them screen at the time where white men would, and then the diagnosis is a more advanced disease. So I think it's diagnostics and availability and of course and specificity and it's going to be very important if we want all this development and all these new medications to really have the impact we're all aiming to have.
Thank you to our panel. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to the Galien Foundation for the focus on science and humanity. This webcast is viewable on the Galien Foundation homepage. And I'd like to close with just the simple statement that we have a lot more work to do. We have a lot more innovation to create together. And this week is about just that. So looking forward to seeing many of you and continuing the conversation with our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.